Gets you every time, doesn't it? Retired British neurosurgeon Henry Marsh has a new book out reflecting on his transition from doctor to patient. After decades of looking at brain scans, he was reluctant to look at his own. Doing so was a humbling experience, forcing him to acknowledge his mortality and his humanity. During his working career, he spent a good bit of time serving in Ukraine. Shortly before COVID, he remembers one young Ukrainian doctor, Olena, who came to see him. She brought him her own brain scan and showed it to him. He spotted the tumor, an acoustic neuroma of some size, at once. Surgery, if not done carefully, could mean life-changing, disfiguring facial paralysis. She asked Henry to do the operation. "I'm not necessarily the best," he told her, "but I trust you," was her reply. "I'll have to think about it," he said. It was not easy. Back in his prime, he was the specialist for tumors like this, and there would be no decision that he would operate. But one of his younger colleagues in his hospital had taken over acoustic neuroma surgery upon his retirement. His dilemma was this: if I asked my colleague to take on the case, was I being a coward? If I did the operation myself, would it be out of vanity and a refusal to admit that my career as a surgeon had ended? I was certain, Marsh writes, that I could still operate well enough, but there was also my fear that my colleague might get a better result than I could. I think there are two important facts about the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness which often get overlooked because we get rather obsessed by the devil. The first big focus of the temptation is the fact that it's a temptation. Jesus, while passing this test with flying colors, as if we really expected anything otherwise, Jesus finds them temptations. So it's worth looking at just what would be tempting Jesus. That first temptation is rather basic. It's food. Jesus, we're told, is hungry because he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights. Israel wandered in the wilderness 40 years, and Israel found that a really hard test. Only because of Moses' intervention, an intervention not without many moments where Moses was fed up with the people, did Israel emerge. Jesus resists the temptation to repeat the miracle of asking for manna. Instead, he perseveres and relies on God. How easy it would be as the Son of God to turn stones into bread. Think of how many people Jesus could feed. This temptation for Jesus is to be who he claims to be, the Son of God. It's like saying, if you are who you are, if you're as powerful as you are, you can do this. But this is ultimately a self-serving temptation. It's a temptation meant to demonstrate power, and exactly who is this demonstration for? Underlying this temptation must be some doubt or question which the temptation goes to the heart of. But what makes this a temptation we can relate to is that Jesus is hungry. Our sense of self can evaporate when we come face to face with hunger and memory of abundance. When our present experience doesn't match our sense of self or the self we used to be, then the voice which says, "If you are," turns into the voice which says, "Now prove it." The second temptation is almost the reverse of the first. While the first temptation aims at our weakness, this temptation is focused on our strength. It's the temptation to prove faith, to prove oneself, not just in word, but in deed. We know God's promise because Scripture gives us a record, a narrative of what God has done in the past. Yet, to know these stories also means to know that we aren't the center of the story. This temptation for us is a reminder of humility, to listen first and foremost. It's the temptation to a faith so certain and sure that it leads to fanaticism. We do well to remember that those who leveled the most criticism of Jesus were experts in Scripture, and the people who turned against Jesus were spiritual people. This temptation is to prove your faith. The third temptation is one that, literally and figuratively, climbs to greater heights. It's the temptation to create a new God in place of God. It's the temptation which comes to think that who we are and everything we do is essential. The sun will not rise the next day unless we're able to perform what we do. Once we pretend that our work is to win the world, then everything which gets in the way of that work must be discarded, and everything which advances our work becomes justifiable. For us, the temptation is to make our work our God, or our lack of work the end of our existence. We have many roles to play over the course of our lives as we grow and mature. Living well means living into our journey, knowing when to take up and when to let go. The devil offers Jesus everything for one moment's acknowledgement. None of us are as good or as bad as people say we are, and no one single act, no one moment's decision sets our character in stone. I mentioned there were two big focuses for us in these temptations. The second big focus is where it comes, immediately after Jesus' baptism. Baptism, whatever we may have thought, is ultimately about our belonging to Christ. It's a type of initiation, an identity which comes to us through promises we make or promises made on our behalf. But it is ultimately about the grace of God. And that's the takeaway of the temptations of Jesus. Jesus' temptations are to prove or achieve his place as the Son of God. And that's a Jesus we can easily relate to, trying to earn our place, feeling the need to justify ourselves, having to prove our worth, are the defining temptations of our working and social lives, and not just our religious lives. We're constantly trying to prove to other people that we're capable, competent, and necessary. How liberating that Jesus shows us what it means to belong to God without these insecurities. Walking along the river Dnieper in Kyiv, Marsh reflected. While he wasn't religious, he writes how he stopped in a small chapel. As he stopped and reflected, he admitted to himself that he often wished to see himself in a heroic role. He acknowledged that his time and his relationships in Ukraine were complicated. There were some failures and some triumphs. Later that day, he met with Alina and her husband in his hotel bar. He told them that he thought his colleague should do the operation. They were reluctant, and Marsh told them, "Only one thing is certain. He can certainly get as good a result as me, and quite possibly a little better." Alina came to London a few weeks later. Her surgery took 20 hours, but Alina emerged intact, her face spared, and she was back in Ukraine after a month. It was a truly spectacular result, Marsh reflects. I was very proud to have such colleagues, but also a little sad. Alina's operation, or rather the fact that I chose not to do it, marked the end of my career as an operating surgeon. I wonder if you were asked to name a turning point in your life, could you do so? I wonder if it would be a turning point which liberated you or a turning point which diminished you. I wonder if your identity might be transformed when temptation meets the Jesus who liberates us by his life, his death, and his resurrection.